Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. Regular viewers, listeners to the show know that I often fall back on Marx's great essay, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, written apparently, at least according to Wikipedia, between December 1851 and March 1852, another time like today of enormous political change. This, of course, was the essay where Marx famously remarked that Hegel remarked somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Marx's great remark about, or revisiting of Hegel came to mind when I read an interesting piece in Harper's Magazine for May by my guest Kyle Paoletta, The Race for Second Place, the Republican Primaries as Farce. And if we were to remix Marx's quote, perhaps in 2016, the election of Trump, or at least his victory in the Republican primary, was a tragedy. But the second time, this time around, it was farce. It's an interesting piece. Paoletta went out on the trail, and what he found was farce, the race for second place. Kyle Paoletta is joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he lives. Kyle, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Marx's 18th Brumaire, but is history once again repeating itself here, first as tragedy and then as farce?
Of course. I mean, I haven't read it in a while, but I appreciate you starting with that quote. I think it's a good way to set the scene here, because you do have this, this idea of covering Donald Trump, the presidential candidate in 2016, as this total oddball, never really seen anything like it. And the way that he just sort of marched to the nomination, I think, was taken as a tragedy by many mainstream Republicans. And then, now a very similar race, I think even less competitive, but the 2016 election was not particularly competitive. But what I really landed on when I was on the trail was how everything was being covered as if there was any drama, any sort of uncertainty about what the outcome of the primary would be, even though the whole time every journalist I spoke to, many campaign aides I spoke to, it was very clear that Trump would be the nominee, and that is exactly what has happened.
Yeah, I want to get to that. Your piece is excellent because it reveals that everyone was saying one thing, but the truth was something else, and everyone kind of knew it. They weren't willing to acknowledge it. As you say, you went out on the trail. In the old days, this was the big deal. The white books on the Kennedy and Reagan and LBJ elections were always a big deal. But what you found was a kind of kabuki show. What was it like being in Des Moines and New Hampshire? Was it bizarre?
Yeah, very surreal. As someone who grew up reading a lot of the sort of literature of the campaign trail, not just Teddy White, but the classic magazine pieces that were written, Hunter S. Thompson, of course, in the 60s, you have DFW doing it in 2000, through the 90s, pretty much anyone who was anyone would do one of these kind of shadowing the campaign press stories. So I think part of what I got interested in was just this idea of like, what is it like now? It's like, is definitely not a form that people have continued to do. And I think it became clear to me exactly why that is, because there really is not, everything is so choreographed. Everything is so sort of you get your schedule at the beginning of the day or the night before of here are all the stops in all the towns that the candidate will be making. You know, there's ample time to get between them. If it's Trump, he has, you know, maybe one rally every night. And then the actual access to the candidate, which is mostly what I focus on the piece, because access is ultimately the entire point of doing any of this. Like, you can film a campaign rally or a town hall. The point of having a person in the room is to actually talk to the candidate, talk to aides, get a sense of what's happening behind the scenes. Access was so tightly restricted and only really opening up in this kind of bizarre push pull where the worse a candidate was doing, the more available they were to the press. That, yeah, it just really became clear to me that you have thousands of journalists who are sort of pursuing these candidates around these states, and with very little to show for it at the end of the day. And it's only exacerbated by the fact that it wasn't a competitive primary. So I think the kind of like surreal nature of it just was very inescapable.
Yeah, it sounds like a Buñuel movie. You talk
Yeah.
about surrealism. And not only that, these candidates were impossible to access, as you say. And yet, when you think about them, DeSantis, who you write about, I mean, the two people competing with Trump,
Mhm.
DeSantis and Haley, these are empty candidates. They have nothing to say. So the less they have to say, the harder they are to access. So we have, in an odd way, and maybe we can fit Marx in somewhere here, Kyle, the disappearance of ideology and its replacement by pure theater.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the there was something about being in a room, especially with DeSantis in Iowa, where he was doing some of these events where there were often 4 times as many press as there were potential caucus goers, and sort of seeing him, you know, go through his stump speech. You know, he had a couple surrogates who were there doing the kind of pump up the very small crowd thing. And then he would take some questions from the audience, and he was not particularly charismatic, but he's a very professional candidate, right? Like, he gets a question in Cedar Bluffs about environmental protection, he's ready with an anecdote about protecting the Everglades in Florida. Um, so, and then Nikki Haley was sort of a very similar experience, but without any of that veneer of policy chops. Is everything she said was very soundbitey, very sort of top level Republican orthodoxy. By the time I was on the trail, she was not taking any questions publicly, mostly because she had kind of flubbed that question about the Civil War in December that turned into a whole news cycle. And after that, she was fully closed off. Um, so, yeah, you sort of had these two candidates who I focus on more than Trump because it was interesting to see them kind of posing themselves as the alternative to Trump while never really going after him, never really trying to create any ideological distance, any policy distance. And at the closest they would ever come was sort of both of them saying, like, you know, I voted for the guy, I supported him during the presidency, but it's, you know, it's time for a new voice for these ideas. Like, it was about as dramatic as it got.
Yeah, and to add to the surrealism here, you mentioned Trump always being in the background, the banquo in this particular Macbeth. Marx famously said at the beginning of the 18th Brumaire, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Trump
Mhm.
wasn't dead, but he could have been. And he did weigh like a nightmare on Haley and DeSantis, who were trying to be Trump without being Trump. That's
Yeah.
what I got out of your piece, and what I got out of, I never followed it that carefully because clearly nothing was happening.
No. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you were going to, the typical Banquo's ghost that would be haunting a Republican primary would be Ronald Reagan, right? And you
Yeah,
see that, certainly 2008, John McCain talked a lot more about Ronald Reagan than he did George W. Bush. So I think there is an interesting way that Donald Trump has replaced Reagan as the kind of animal spirit of the Republican Party while still very much being, alive and the presumptive nominee who could be the president again. And I think seeing that, it was as if people in 1984 were running against Reagan under a Reaganist platform. It just like didn't make sense to have these candidates doing a Trump thing when Trump was in the race.
yeah. Well, you mentioned 1984. We probably could figure out a way to include Orwell too.
And now we're
Speaking of,
checking all the boxes here.
yeah, well, we'll leave that one out. I'm sure we'll fit that one in later. As we speak, Kyle, Trump is involved in one kind of bizarre legal theater or another. The news today is witness testimony in his hush money trial. That's where all the attention is in court. People are wondering about how far Trump will go in the next election if he's elected. But I wonder, you mentioned in the piece that all this was just Trump theater. One of the people you bring up in your piece is Brick Suit Marnell, this bizarre character who follows Trump all around. To what extent was the whole show, and it is a show, of course, was Trumpian theater, even if Trump wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I really tried to highlight in the piece was how the political press is very much playing by the same playbook that goes back to the 60s of going to these retail events, talking to voters before and after, what did you hear? What resonated with you? Did this change your vote? And doing this very kind of like nuts and bolts style of coverage when Donald Trump is a very much a candidate of the internet age, of the mass media age, where everything is theater, it's a show, it's a huge, people have compared a lot of his rallies to concerts. And I had that experience when I went to a rally in Manchester of, people selling merch outside and, supporters chatting about like, oh, I saw him, 4 years ago in Laconia. I'm so glad I get to see it. Like, there's a very kind of like
Yeah, it's
Grateful
Bruce
Dead aspect.
Springsteen,
Yeah, Bruce Springsteen, sure.
or Madonna, or who's the woman now that everyone's going to? Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift, yeah, for sure. And I think the idea that he is a candidate who supersedes the need for this kind of glad handing at a, fried seafood place or at the barbecue place in Ames. Like, I think the media still hasn't quite figured that out. And you bring up the case in New York right now, and that's been really interesting to me because I think the media is so glad to have a way to cover Trump in a framework it understands of a legal case that has very specific beats, that is very predictable. Now we're doing jury selection, now we're doing prosecution witnesses. And, like there's a way in which the coverage of him after another primary of just sort of throwing stuff at the wall is sort of settled into like, now we can be in a courtroom.
Right, and to add to all the surrealism, they're covering one narrative, and he's dealing with something else, and the traditional press just doesn't get it. The piece, which, as I said, I thought was very good, covers a lot of the traditional press, its demise, but there were some heavy-hitting big media writers on the trail. Dana Milbank, for example, who's been on the show. He had a book out last year on the Republicans as a quote unquote destructionist party. Do any of these people like Milbank, in your view, Kyle, really get it? Or are they all just covering a different age and using language? It goes back to Marx, of borrowing language from the past to describe something that they don't really understand.
Yeah, I think there's certainly I don't want to sound too sweeping in my criticism because I think there are for sure journalists who are on the trail who are doing a good job, and a lot of them were the
Yeah, and I
ones.
don't mean to say they're doing a bad job. They're doing their best. That people like Milbank are very smart, but they don't
Yeah,
quite grasp what is really happening. Doesn't seem to
no,
me.
no, I don't think so. And I mean, I think Dana's great, and I think I saw him in New Hampshire very much kind of parachuting, and I could kind of see, and we were chatting about just the how kind of like vapid it felt to be at this. I think it was at a rally for Nikki Haley. But I think the reporters I was really impressed by were the ones who were sort of backing away from the horse race. So like Daniel Kersleben at NPR, who I had a really nice conversation with, she was really talking to me about how, so she grew up in Iowa and she was covering the primary there. And her focus was really just talking to Trump supporters and getting into this sort of mindset, the what resonates, why they are so dedicated to him. And to me, like that kind of reporting, it's not as attention grabbing or headline grabbing, but I find it so much more valuable to actually understand, what are the dynamics at play? What are the reasons things are happening? While you can kind of just look at polls to get a sense of what is happening, it's like the why is what I look for in political journalism. And so, yeah, just the over attention to, you know, this candidate's in this place doing this thing, it doesn't tell you very much.
Yeah, you don't even mention the pollsters who are increasingly absurd, always have been, probably always will be. You mentioned Olivia Nuzzi, if that's the right way, Nuzzi,
Mhm.
Nuzzi, who's quite a high profile young journalist, a kind of maybe a little bit of a female Hunter Thompson. Are there younger journalists on the trail, your generation, who are revisiting the work of people like Thompson and treating this as theater and writing about it in that kind of way?
Yeah, Olivia's a great example. I mean, I think her work's by and large really good. And she wrote a great piece about Iowa last summer that was sort of all the also rans of the Republican primary, where she was talking about Mike Pence and Chris Christie and them kind of going through the motions. And I think she, better than anyone, really captured the absurdity of that moment. That even then, you know, 6 months before the caucus, it was so clear that all of this was kind of nonsense. So I think, yeah, I think her work is really good. Phil Wegman at Real Clear Politics, I thought, he's a sharp guy, and um, oh gosh, Audrey Fahlberg at the National Review as more of a kind of conservative voice. I think she was someone who was the doing very much the kind of like blocking and tackling of political coverage of going to the events and doing that, but was very much on the phones actually reporting out stuff
Yeah, you're
that
right,
was used against him.
Kyle. And the whole exercise is perhaps summed up by the word trudge. As I trudged from event to event, it became obvious that the political press had not yet adjusted to the digital era. I mean, I've been reading that sentence now since the 1990s. The
Right?
digital
Yeah.
era is so, it changes from year to year, sometimes from month to month. Um, is there still a political press? I mean, does it even exist anymore?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I mean, I would say that the political press, the sort of like old idea of the political press, at least as far as print goes, exists almost solely at the New York Times. That they're the only outlet that has the resources to
Yeah,
sort
Maggie
of
Haberman gets a walk on part at the
right.
beginning of the essay.
Yeah, where they kind of have the combo of the, just people to just be warm bodies in the room, as well as a handful of star reporters of her, Jonathan Swan, who are doing kind of the deeper investigative stuff. Um, Aside from that, even the Washington Post only had a handful of people on the trail. Reuters and the AP had plenty of people, but the I mean, I don't think I think I briefly talked to someone from Time. Like, I was the only magazine writer who I encountered. I know the New Yorker sent some people to Iowa that I didn't bump into, but there's
Yeah.
just so many fewer people. And honestly, a lot of the press was international, especially
Yeah,
in
yeah, the
Iowa.
BBC and the Guardian gets a little bit of coverage.
Yeah.
And of course, the piece is also, in a sense, haunted by media layoffs. You note that while you were there were big layoffs at the LA Times. So there are fewer and fewer journalists.
Yeah.
But maybe we don't, we all bemoan it. And of course, it's the standard coastal complaint. We no longer have press and no one believes anything. But in this world, do we even need press? I mean, what would be the point of press to report on Brick Marnell?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I did that. I think that was the thing that really struck me and why it felt so discordant to be, chatting with people about these layoffs that were happening at the same time. So many people were there covering basically a non-story. I really had a feeling of like, well, geez, like if if our profession has been so is sort of so decayed and we have so many fewer resources, why is this what we're spending it on? Like I do think there is a better way, and maybe it is, send a camera from all the major networks, someone from the Wires and someone from the New York Times. They'll pretty much cover all the angles you need of these sort of retail events, and everyone else just focus on, you know, figuring out fundraising, figuring out how state parties are being staffed, like figure out these sort of like local factors that will play a huge role in a national election. I do feel like there's a deep imbalance of, you know, we need to have our pictures of the DeSantis rally, which is a very old school mindset of like, we want to make sure our logos at the bottom of the film of DeSantis, and it's so meaningless in the current media environment. It just, you're spending resources for these kind of like useless things that don't matter to anyone who's actually viewing it.
Yeah, well, it's not entirely meaningless, Carl. You still write for Harper's, which I think is a good publication. We cover lots of their writers. And I also remind everyone that there still are good publications out there, maybe not traditional newspapers, but Liberties, a new quarterly journal of culture and politics, does an excellent job covering our increasingly surreal world, the world that Kyle Paoletta reported on in the Republican primary. Is going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Kyle to talk more broadly about the political lessons, if there are any, that he learned on the trail of in the race for second place in Iowa and New Hampshire. So we'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
You can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Kyle Paoletta, a writer on Harper's, has an excellent new piece on his experiences in Iowa and New Hampshire, the race for second place, the Republican primaries this year. Kyle, for all the surrealism, the oddity of it, there is a real world out there. What did you find in Iowa and New Hampshire? They're real people, real struggles. What was your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I wish I had had more of an opportunity to talk to actual people. This is the curse of when you do a lot of media writing and you're focused on kind of the media angle, you end up just talking to journalists. But I did get a sense, especially in Iowa, the way in which the caucus is this sort of every 4 years event that I think some people get really excited about, and for some people, it's just sort of this like economic feature. I mean, I remember talking to the woman who runs this really beautiful venue in a town about an hour west of Des Moines that mostly does weddings. But she was saying, oh, every 4 years, every single candidate comes through here. And the same, there's a famous barbecue place that I I witnessed two journalists who had not seen each other since Ted Cruz did an event at that same barbecue place 8 years ago. So there's this roteness that is really embedded in the culture of those two states. And I think it was really interesting getting a sense of, I think people realize how unusual that is, and also that it probably will not stay that way for very long. I mean, especially in New Hampshire with Joe Biden basically ceding that primary because of his deference to James Clyburn in South Carolina. Um, I think a lot of New Hampshire folks I talked to were very much like, yeah, I mean, we're probably just not going to be the first in the nation primary anymore. And they were sort of a mixture of like sad about that as this historical role the state has played, but also realistic. I mean, especially on the Democratic side, they're like, yeah, we're one of the whitest states. Probably doesn't make sense to have us have this kind of
Right,
outside
and you're currently
control.
also your day job is as a writer for different magazines, but you're writing a book about the cities of the Southwest for Pantheon. I think the
Mhm.
book will be out in the next couple of years. Get you back on the show, talk about that. Does the
It,
decline of the primary system in Midwestern state like Iowa or classic New England state like New Hampshire, does it speak of a shift of power, geographic power from the Midwest and the Northeast to the West, to the
uh,
Southwest?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's something that I write about in my book. And wrote a article for the New Republic last year about Arizona and Nevada, that's sort of highlighting how important those states have become in national elections. And I, I'm writing another thing about Arizona for this upcoming election. Yeah, I think there is a way that this is like an old system that dates back to an older version of America. And when you look at the actual electoral map, and beyond that, just sort of the demographics of the country, just many more people live in the Sun Belt now than did in, the 60s and 70s when these traditions were formed. And I think it's good to have the parties recognizing that. And, a state like Nevada that has been moved up on the calendar that is much more reflective of sort of like Las Vegas is a much better representation of America than Des Moines is. Like we're a much more urbanized country, we're a much more diverse country. We have a much more service-based economy. Like there are all these ways in which I think it's actually quite good for us to, you know, be moving away from that old system and beyond any particular state primaries, moving into more of a national electoral mode. That these are national elections that we should be talking about in national terms. And I don't really have a problem with, corn subsidies in Iowa being an important thing that every candidate needs to weigh in on. Yeah, like that feels very esoteric and kind of irrelevant to
So
people.
does that? We've had a lot of shows about the need for constitutional reform and getting away of doing away with the electoral college
Yeah.
and other kinds of significant structural constitutional reform. But are you suggesting that the country is changing and this shift of power is happening in a way that we will begin to make sense of over the next few years, with or without constitutional reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already happened in many ways. I mean, I think the nationalization of the electorate is real. The sort of polarization becoming a much more is based much more on education than it is on even race. Is that it is reflective of, you know, you have a class of kind of wealthy urbanites who go to a select number of colleges and then go to a select number of neighborhoods across the country that kind of look like each other. Like, I think that has already happened. And in many ways, I think, you know, setting aside whether or not we should have the electoral college, I certainly don't think we should. But I the way that we talk about politics is very national now. And I think a lot of what I observed on the campaign trail was this sort of nostalgia for a more localized version of presidential elections. And even, you know, I talked to a journalist from the Boston Globe who, you know, went to school in Iowa, covered elections there, covered elections in New Hampshire. And he was like genuinely pretty upset that these local stops don't have the
Yeah,
power
this
they
was
do.
James Pindell, and he
Yeah,
said to
James.
you, he introduced himself, I'm in James Pindell, and I'm sad. Probably sad because he's been made redundant. Not
Yeah.
literally, but because what he does and what he's been studying, writing about for years is no longer relevant.
Yeah, and I think James is a really sharp observer of politics. Like, I think his column for the Globe is excellent, and people should read it. But I think he very much was a creature of that, you know, shaking hands with everyone in the diner style of politics. And I think a lot of people of that generation, that is what politics means. And your idea of a politician looks more like Bill Clinton than it does Donald Trump. And I think the idea of politics as a mass medium is not new at all, but it's just inescapable now. Like, it's just inarguable that that
Yeah,
is
I
how
remember
it
in
happens.
2016, I went to one of the Republican debates and I saw the back of Trump and his wife and Malaria, whatever her name is. And there was that theatrical element. I'd never met Clinton. I would have guessed it would be a different kind of experience. What about Kyle? And I think a lot of this also explains why local press is going away. You mentioned the Boston Globe. I'm not sure how long that paper will last, but most of the local newspapers have gone away. There's a lot of mourning for that, but maybe it's a reflection of a broader reality. What about the standard sort of coastal media reading of America, of this deeply divided country, of deplorables, of polarization, of angry Americans? Did you find that, or is that just a preoccupation and a lazy assumption of elite journalists?
I think I mean, there is a strain of like deep anger and resentment in the country for sure. I think that as something that is particular to Republicans is not necessarily true. And I don't think that it explains everything. I mean, when I was in New Hampshire going to these Trump events, I would say almost everyone I was standing in line around was from Massachusetts. And they were driving up because they're like, well, he's not going to do a rally here. But, you know, in New Hampshire, it's a 45-minute drive, and I can kind of like scratch that itch of having someone kind of say all the things you're not supposed to say. Or, you know, like, I remember even one guy, very well dressed, overcoat, nice scarf, who was saying like, oh, if my neighbors knew that I was going to see Trump tonight,
It's
like,
the equivalent of going to the strip,
absolutely,
the strip club in the old days. Now you can watch strip clubs online. Now you go to a Trump rally.
Yeah. So I think there's I think it gets really reductive when you talk about these issues as sort of like the coasts are this way and the interior of the country is this way. I think there is, again, there's real anger and resentment that I think is bipartisan. And I think the most successful politicians of the past 20 years are the ones who have been able to channel that into a coalition. And I think Barack Obama was very good at that. I mean, I think he met that sort of sense of disinvestment and being left behind, especially in the Midwest, with, you know, hope and change, and we're going to lift you up and we're going to fix this. And Trump met it with, yeah, you should be mad, and here's the people you should be mad at. Like, I think economic issues are the thing that drives so much in this country, and politicians who get overly focused on, I don't know, what's happening on the New York Times opinion page. Like, people don't care about that. Like when
so Carville or Clinton was right. It's the economy stupid. You mentioned Time magazine, an interesting piece in Time about how far Trump will go. Did you get any sense? I mean, my sense is it's his election to lose. It's hard to obviously predict, particularly with him. But did you get any sense of the given your experience on the trail, even if Trump wasn't around? Did you get any sense of what a second Trump term would be like?
I mean, I think that interview was illuminating and certainly alarming. I think all of that is accurate. No one who I've talked to or spent time with is, you know, I don't think any of this is a political pose. I think it's all very serious. I would say that what I maybe have some insight to is the sort of the thirst of his constituents for that, you know, when I was seeing him in New Hampshire, and he was sort of, this is right after he had first said that thing about, you know, I'll be a dictator on the first day in office, which is sort of a classic Trump one-liner of like, here's the really, you know, things that's going to piss everyone off, and now I'll kind of like slightly undercut it, but also in a way that makes it true. Like when he was talking about that to the crowd, they were loving it. Yeah, like I think there is a real constituency for a borderline dictatorial version of a Trump presidency that I certainly feel extremely alarmed about.
Although, is it the theater of authoritarianism or real authoritarianism? Is it Trump behaving as if he's an authoritarian, Charlie Chaplin as Hitler, or I don't want to bring the Hitler analogies because that's boring, but or is this for real, or is it just all play acting?
I think that's the question. And like what I was saying earlier is I think it's for real from Trump and his people. I think they are very serious about basically concentration camps for undocumented immigrants. Like, I don't think that is a pose at all. I think for people who are excited about Trump, who are, you know, buying the gear, going to his concerts, following him around the country, that I'm not as sure about. If there is a, I think Brick Marnell,
he's Marnell on the show. I don't know.
I'm sure he would love. He will talk to anyone who asks, and I'm sure he would.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how valuable the conversation. Maybe, I mean, Brick, if you're watching, you can come on the show if you wear your Brick jacket. Finally, let's go back to Marx, who always made more sense of things than most other people. Leaving aside the history repeating itself, he also famously said in that wonderful essay on 18th Brumaire, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. how can we make our own history in this surreal world that is so absurdly theatrical, so hard to make any sense of? Have we lost agency, Kyle, or can we, either as a conservative or a progressive, can we rediscover agency in this theater of the absurd that you observed in Iowa and New Hampshire?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I think I mean, I'm not in the business of giving prescriptions, but I think
Well,
there,
you can. I want prescriptions. That's why you're on the
yeah,
show.
I guess so. This is the line between being a journalist and a
That
opinion
line
writer,
has gone
right?
away. That's what you were
Right.
reporting on in the
Uh,
piece.
but I would say there, I mean, going back to sort of economic issues or even, quote unquote social issues like abortion, things that actually affect people's daily life, that's the stuff to me that always cuts through the theater. And you've seen that in the last, in the midterm elections and even, these very conservative states that have passed abortion protections. That to me is a real indication of, oh, this is an issue that touches people very literally, and that matters in a way that kind of a lot of verbiosity doesn't. And I think economics is part of that. I think the sort of hampering of your personal liberty to live your life as you would see fit, like that stuff matters. And I think the you ignore that at your own peril if you're a
So are you
politician.
saying that if the Democrats play the traditional game and the Republicans are playing an entirely different game, one is playing perhaps American football, the other is playing European football, that the Democrats will win?
I wouldn't say that. I would say if all the Republicans are doing is kind of the Trump show, I would give the Democrats a little bit better odds than maybe the betting markets do. But I think they're the idea that like, oh, if you're just kind of a, technocratic, competent Democrat, I also don't think that. I don't know. There's a balance. You need to actually speak to people about things that affect them, but you also need to motivate them and persuade them and make them care and make them feel excited. And that's the stuff Democrats are terrible at. And that stuff Trump is really good at. So